Today, some of the big news was that Black Lives Matter, Seattle, King County, they sent a letter over to, let me make sure and get this right here. They sent it over to Wayne Barnett, who's the director of the Seattle Ethics and Election Commission. They outlined a bunch of grievances against city council members that they want Wayne Barnett to follow up on. Tell us all about it.
Yeah, so let's just do a little background on the Ethics and Elections Commission, right? So it's a volunteer commission, and their paid staff is headed by Wayne Barnett, their executive director. The Ethics and Elections Commission, which is created by a Seattle ordinance, enforces three pieces of Seattle's law. The ethics code, which deals with everything from financial disclosures and conflicts of interest and things like that, to retaliation against employees by officials, to misuse of public funds and public resources. So that's the ethics code. They enforce that. They enforce the Seattle election campaign code, so making sure there's the right financial disclosures, that election campaigns are following all the right rules and all that. And then the third thing that they enforce is Seattle's whistleblower protection code. But that's it, right? That is sort of the scope of what they get to do. So there's a lot of stuff that you might think they have something to do with it. They actually don't. They can't do anything about something that, if you think that a official has violated their oath of office, they can't do anything about that. They don't enforce the Open Public Meetings Act. They don't enforce the Public Records Act. They don't enforce any other laws having to do with the city, right? So it's just those three areas right there. So then the letter from Black Lives Matter has a long list of complaints, 9 or 10 different areas, and a lot of them actually are really outside the scope of those three areas. There are a few they're in the scope, and we can kind of talk about what those are about. It's probably a good place to start. So it starts out with a couple of allegations about questioning how city council members kind of early on in the protests were potentially questioning, maybe even sort of interrogating at some level, city employees, looking maybe for some dirt on other protesters, and kind of what was going on, what the real skinny was with the protests, and potentially even kind of with the intent to retaliate against city employees who might be members of Black Lives Matter and might have been involved in the protests. And more allegations there about were they soliciting or securing confidential information about Black Lives Matter's protesters? Did they attempt to conceal information that they were collecting about this? Were they attempting to retaliate against city employees using this information? And then they made some allegations, actually a repeated allegation that's in the recall petition against Councilmember Sawant, that she was misusing city resources that night that she used her passkey to open up City Hall and held a protest/rally, inside kind of the main hallway of City Hall there. So those are things sort of in the scope of things that the Ethics and Elections Commission might actually investigate. There's a whole bunch of stuff that they allege that's really outside the scope, looking at whether City Hall violations for various different things, attempts to discredit information that they were getting from law enforcement agencies, either SPD or other local law enforcement agencies or state or federal agencies. Did they violate the city charter by undermining the chief of police sort of authority to run the police by showing up at protests on a couple of nights? Things like that. So there's a lot of the stuff that they allege that really the Ethics and Elections Commission isn't really going to be able to do anything about. Now, I quickly touched base with Wayne Barnett this afternoon. He's still looking at the letter. He had no comment at this point about it, but we'll see what he thinks about a couple of these areas. But I think some of their allegations that even are within scope might be kind of hard for him to investigate anyway, just because they're very vague allegations. They don't sort of name specific people that things happen to.
Right. So, I mean, you think this is like a preamble or something? Like they've got an introductory letter, and then hoping that Wayne Barnett
come
looks
back
into
with more
it
details.
Yeah, I mean,
and he's going to come back
is
and say,
it
"Tell me
usually how
more."
it happens?
Well, I think we would have to get more information from Barnett about that. And the instances where I've interacted with him, usually these kinds of complaints, start with somebody alleging something very specific, like this thing happened, right? And there are a couple of those in here. Things like Sawant opening up City Hall, right? Is that a misuse of public resources? That's a very specific thing where there's very specific evidence. But saying, hey, did city council members, try to talk to city employees and potentially retaliate against them? Like, if you're not going to name specific people, that's going to be really hard to investigate.
So do you think that this was released to do just this, have us talking about it, or was it released to actually have Barnett dig into something? Because, like you said, some of it seems pretty vague.
I think that's hard to say. There's clearly a lot of anger in this letter, right? And anger kind of directed at the city council. So is it kind of, a political approach to try to get city council members in trouble and put more scrutiny on them? It could be. Now, I've heard you say that, with this sort of thing, the Black community is really not monolithic about it. There's lots of different kinds of views on what the mayor's been doing, what the city council has been doing, and what these different advocacy groups, whether it's Black Lives Matter or Decriminalize Seattle or King County Equity Now, are doing. So, tell me what you see in this.
In a lot of the mayor's press conferences, not as of recent, but and over the last few months, you've heard the mayor reference Black Lives Matter, Seattle, King County in several press conferences, back even when they were trying to figure out the situation with the CHOP after the CHOP was cleared and everything else. So, I mean, clearly with the mayor mentioning Black Lives Matter, Seattle, King County from her official position there in the city, it would seem to me like maybe Black Lives Matter, Seattle, King County is more aligned, I guess you'd say, with the mayor's camp. And it looks like King County Equity Now and Decrim is more aligned with the city council. So,
that's a fascinating dynamic that we have, two branches of the city government, right, who, I've certainly heard, and I know you've been asking them hard about, like, who are you talking to in the Black community, right? And so, now sort of, is this it also kind of feels a little bit like, Stephen Colbert's, My Black Friend, right? It's like, they're both like, hey, look, here's my credibility with the Black community. Look at these groups that I've affiliated myself. Is that, do you think, what's going on here?
Yeah, well, I mean, you got to think like this, though. The mayor has to have a Black group. Whenever she gets ready to roll out this $100 million that she's promised, $1 billion over 10 years, she has to have a Black group with a big name. You know what I'm saying? Really at the podium with her, or else people are going to be like, oh, they're not going to find it credible. Now, she's been quick to march out the Black pastors, things like that before, and not even discredit the Black pastor. All these people play a role in a position in the community, but so she's been heavy on that, for at least for the last few months, and saying that she's been talking to Black pastors and everything else. So, she needs some Blackness basically there. And so, I don't know how deep or entrenched the relationship with the mayor and Black Lives Matter Seattle King County is. Like I said, we could only go off of the fact that the mayor many a times from the podium mentions them specifically, especially when it comes to talking about things, with the Black community and people that she's working with. So yeah, it's a very interesting dynamic in that, you have King County Equity Now, you have Decrim and all these people. Like I said, on one side of the issue with city council, you very well have Black Lives Matter, Seattle King County on the other side of the issue with Mayor Durkin. I think one thing that's interesting, and you tell me, you've analyzed these documents, and I mean, we just did a thing here on, on the morning show about recall Sawant. There's a recall going on, And then recall Sawant, a lot of the grievances in recall Sawant are a lot of the same grievances that the mayor sent in her letter to city council a few days after Councilmember Sawant led a march on her house. And now so at least one or maybe more of the same grievances against Sawant is in this Black Lives Matter Seattle King County document. And I mean, I'm interested as
you're connecting the dots there, huh? It's like,
well, I mean, well, yeah,
could
I
this
mean,
be, you know, and well, I mean, full disclosure, a couple of things in the recall Sawant thing, though, I've asked him for information. Other than that, that's sort of the extent of the conversation I've had. Two of the 4 things that they're going forward and charging were things that came out of original reporting that I did. So, I'm in a bit of an awkward position kind of talking about this space because, I in my reporting on the council brought a bunch of these things to the forefront. And some of them have been around for a while. One of those issues is from over a year and a half ago, right? There's some kind of early this year before COVID happened and before the, George Floyd and the protests happened. But, I think you're raising a good point, right? Where in the political machinations of Seattle, where are these groups behind the scenes deciding to work together, and really who are the folks working together? And I think, to me, the bigger question is really how do we figure out the extent to which they are representing with accuracy and fidelity the Black community and the needs and desires of the Black community. And that comes back to, again, to the point that you've made many times, which is the Black community is not monolithic, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is the thing. There's a lot of people. There's a lot of people in the Black community who aren't necessarily for defund in its current position. There's a lot of people that that feel differently than King County Equity now, and that's okay. Like any community, there should be diversity of thought and everything else. I just think that this dynamic is going to be very interesting. See, here's what I think is really what's coming down the pipe. What I think might be coming down the pipe, and we'll see what happens, is that a lot of people in Seattle, and we can tell by the protest and the different dynamics going on in the protest, they're not versed in it. They just hear protests, or they hear this and that, or Black Lives Matter, or whatever, and they kind of go along with it. And so what very well might happen is what comes out of City Hall is that the mayor makes an agreement, and the majority of people see actual Seattleites. The majority of the people, Seattleites, are like, oh, wow, this is great. The mayor has made a deal. Everything is great for Black people moving forward. Because, most people in Seattle just want things to be better for everybody. You know what I'm saying? The majority of people in Seattle, I'm not buying into this every far left, far right. Most people in Seattle are just regular, everyday people. They want, the next guy to be okay. And so I think that what we're seeing here is the stage being set for, some political fandangling here in the next few weeks. And what we're going to hear is messaging coming out of downtown saying that, that the grand compromise has been struck and, Black people's lives are going to be forever changed. And I mean, that's what I'm really out here keeping my eye on for, because everything that we've been through as a city, through these protests and everything that my community has been through, the Black community has been through here for over nearly 140 years, it can't come down to smoke and mirrors.
Right. So in your estimation, if a grand compromise is reached, in order for that to be legitimate, who has to be at the table? Right? Because the mayor could reach a grand compromise with Black Lives Matter, and the city council could reach a grand compromise with King County Equity Now and Decrim Seattle, and their compromises could be completely different, right? So if there is a legitimate one, who do all three of those organizations? Do other organizations have to be at the table? Like, who really has to be represented to make this real?
I'll be honest with you, and I reached out to Black Lives Matter Seattle King County because I really wanted to talk to them and ask them a few questions to get an understanding. They haven't gotten back to me. I've actually tried to interview them a few times. They've never gotten back to me. But one of the things that I'd be interested to know from Black Lives Matter Seattle King County is that, okay, they didn't leave King County Equity Now because of a difference in actual ideology. They left King County Equity Now because of a difference in a leadership, one of the leaders over there. You see what I'm saying? So that being the case, what happened between them leaving? Because when they were in King County Equity Now, they stood for defund, right? But if you read this complaint to Wayne Barnett, and you tell me, you're better at this stuff than me. Point number 8 in here, it says that whether council members acted in accordance and within the proper channels and procedures of the government structure when proposing or taking action to realign the city budget disproportionately through cuts to the Seattle Police Department, and whether council members made or should have made public disclosures of intent prior to doing so. And I mean, so to me, that sounds like what they're saying is one of their grievances is that city council moved to basically cut or defund SPD. I don't know. That's the way I read it. Why do you read it?
Yeah, I think there's two parts to that. I think it's sort of the grievance at one level is certainly, hey, you defunded SPD, which seems like a weird thing coming from Black Lives Matter or Seattle King County. Technically, what they're really saying here in the words is, did the city council violate the Open Public Meetings Act, right? Did it have meetings and make agreements and do things that should have been disclosed to the public, but didn't disclose those things to the public? But I think you're right that, the really interesting part here is they're calling out, you made decisions to defund the police department. Right.
Exactly. But so the thing is the interesting question is what changed in Seattle, in Black Lives Matter, Seattle King County, in their ideology between when they were in King County Equity Now and now? Because when they were in King County Equity Now, clearly, one of their biggest things in King County Equity Now is defund. And reading this point number 8, it doesn't sound like they're with that. And then point number 9 says whether council members sought written advice from commission on any appearance of impropriety or influence from selected outside actors prior to proposing or taking action to realign the city budget disproportionately through cuts of Seattle Police Department. I read that as they sought written advice or impropriety or influence from selected outside actors. I see is that like a special interest group? Outside actors? Is that King County Equity Now? Is that D-Crime? Is that, clearly it's not spelled out clearly, or else we wouldn't be asking these questions. But
yeah, the missing who in here, how vague they are is sort of a telltale sign in some ways. Kind of on the technical side of this, for the council members to be seeking advice from the commission, it would really have to come back to the ethics code. Like they would go seek advice if there was a conflict of interest, a financial conflict of interest, if council members had, some interest of their own that questioned their sort of objectivity or their judgment on this, they're allowed to go talk to whoever the heck they want, right? And seek advice and be influenced from pretty much anybody that they want, right? The rules mostly say that they have to disclose it. If it's, there are some cases that say, they can't participate and like vote on issues where they personally have a financial interest. But in terms of like, who they're talking to, they can talk to anybody they want, right? And that's largely what the Ethics Commission has told them over and over again. You can talk to whoever the heck you want. You can, seek, you can be influenced largely by whoever you want. There are some cases where you have to disclose that these are the people that you're talking to. In many cases you don't, right? If you run into somebody in the street and talk to them, right? In most cases you don't actually have to disclose that at all. So there's a lot of stuff sort of in there that's red herring. But the fact that I think, and comes back to what you were saying, I think the fact that Black Lives Matter is raising it in this way, saying, very vaguely, selected outside actors, right, is sort of casting about for questioning, who the city council is, who they're being influenced with, and and there might be even should we be reading some sort of competitive urges in this, like is this a fight for seats at the table to say, hey, the city council isn't listening to us enough?
I mean, clearly. Well, the thing is that I don't want to overspeak here, but there was some messaging that came over before saying that like city council members shouldn't just be meeting with anybody. I mean, my position was that I'm not opposed to whoever the city council wants to meet. That's what they're supposed to do. We've always wanted to know if who is it, who are the experts that they're talking to, that they're relying upon to be able to shape this new great future for Black people in the city of Seattle. And I think that's important. But I don't think that I'm not here to say who they cannot talk to. You see what I'm saying? I'd want to know, who are you talking to? Because like you said, I don't think that there's any limitations on who they can talk to. And like I said, another thing that jumped out on for me was like the Sawant, when letting people into City Hall for a protest over there. I didn't know that bothered Black Lives Matter Seattle King County that much. I know that it clearly bothered Mayor Durkin. It bothered a lot of people in Rico. It bothered a lot of people in the city as a whole. I mean, without a doubt. And even in our community, Black community, a lot of people are like, man, why did she go and do that? But it's just interesting that it shows up here amongst their list of grievances.
Yeah, well, and I've certainly heard people, I'm sure you have too, and this may be part of what you were just saying, raising concerns that Sawant was attempting to co-opt the protests over the summer. And you saw her, even at that night at the rally in City Hall, she injected a lot of tax Amazon messaging into
I interviewed her the night, it was June 8th. That was the same day that the Seattle Police Department abandoned the East Precinct. And I interviewed her right there, and I said, do you consider this a victory for your movement? She was like, man, this was her victory. And so
so I think maybe there's a bit of that driving this in the
Black Lives Matter Seattle King County, throughout the whole time the Western Barricade was there. We used to tweet them because you see Black Lives Matter, BLM everywhere.
Yeah.
It's crazy because it's campaign, it's a part of organization. And so I talked to them plenty of times via Twitter, say, hey man, are you guys part of this Western Barricade protest? And on several occasions they said, no, we don't have any people there. They were telling people kind of to protest from home digitally because of COVID and everything else. So, if someone did come in like the War Eagle there and claim victory, she didn't claim it away from Black Lives Matter Seattle King County, because they said all along
they weren't
that
there,
they weren't part of the protests that were up there on Capitol Hill. Like I said, I think that it's interesting, and I think that probably the citizen stakeholders in the city of Seattle probably want to watch what's going to unfold here closely, and watch how, because you definitely have two sides here that are very much, they're aligning their sides.
At least two sides.
At least two that we know about, right? At least these two sides here. And I think that, this letter says a lot, and what it doesn't say kind of even speaks even louder about it. And it would be interesting for Mayor Durkin, we'll call the mayor's office and just ask over at the mayor, what is their current relationship with Black Lives Matter Seattle King County? Let's see what Mayor Durkin and her office has to say about that. Because like I said, it's some of the wordsmithing in this letter and everything else kind of leads you to believe that some of the core things that they were believing in or were pushing when they were part of the King County Equity Now coalition, they might no longer be believing or pushing that same ideology. And it makes you wonder why, what changed.
Yeah, that's a good question. I will take it as an action item to go ask the mayor's office, and we'll see what they say.